Good evening, and welcome once again to the MacArthur Memorial. We're glad to have you with us tonight. Tonight we have Lesley Blume and her new book, Fallout. It's the story of John Hersey and his revelation about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. After the bombings in August of 1945, the U.S. War Department restricted anybody from going to those two cities. Military teams, medical teams, government teams were allowed to go there, but reporters were not. The U.S. War Department forbade that. And any reporters that tried to go there, they were obstructed or they were censored. And it wasn't until August of 1946 that the story of what happened on the ground was published by John Hersey in the New Yorker. Hersey was able to get in there, and really for the first time people understood the horrific effects of what these bombs could do. And this Fallout is the story of how John Hersey got this information published. This is Lesley Blume's second book of nonfiction. The accolades are rolling in. We're very glad that she was able to use the MacArthur archives in her research, and we're very happy that she is here with us tonight. So please enjoy tonight's presentation, and don't forget to join us afterward, where we will have Ms. Blume here live for questions and answers. And thanks for coming, and good night.
Thank you very much to the MacArthur Memorial team for inviting me to give this presentation. And before I begin, I'd like to just give a quick shout out to Jim Zobel, who helped me with the research and guidance on this project, even in the earliest, most daunting days of my research. Navigating one's way through the labyrinth and stacks of General MacArthur and General MacArthur's and SCAP's records is no joke, but he helped a lot. My book Fallout documents how the US government and occupation forces downplayed, spun, and covered up the true atomic aftermath in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how one reporter, John Hersey of the New Yorker magazine, was able to get into Hiroshima and alert the world about the catastrophic human toll there, as well as the US's experimental new megaweapons, namely that they were the weapons that continued to kill long after detonation. For many, Hersey's story, even though it came out more than a year after the bombing, was the first event that made them realize the implications of having entered into the atomic age. Today, I'll give the broad strokes of the story behind Hersey's New Yorker article, which he titled Hiroshima, Today, I'll give the broad strokes of the story behind Hersey's New Yorker article, also titled Hiroshima, which is still widely considered the most influential work of written investigative journalism ever created, and which has played its own role in ensuring that nuclear weapons have not been used in warfare since 1945. And so for this audience, I've chosen to highlight in brief, you can get more details in Fallout, how Hersey got into occupied Japan in the first place, and how General MacArthur's GHQ, or General Headquarters, and PRO, or Press Relations Office, was able to strictly regulate occupation journalists' lives and reporting activity, and lay out the relationship between the Allied Occupation Press Corps and General MacArthur's forces. This has been an underexplored topic in the past, and I was lucky to be able to study and portray the vibrant world of the first year of the occupation through this angle. Starting in August of 1945, post-bomb Hiroshima had been designated a restricted topic for media by occupation forces, and same for any reporting on either side of the Atlantic pertaining to nuclear matters in general by the US government, even though wartime censorship had officially ended in autumn of 1945. Now, by the time John Hersey got into Japan in May of 1946, Japan and the incoming press were essentially in lockdown by General MacArthur's forces. I always approached this project as a journalist covering another journalist, and as all reporters know, especially war reporters, whoever controls the ground controls the story, or so the saying goes. So I went into my Fallout research determined to reconstruct Hersey's entry into the country, how he operated on the ground when he was there, and then how he managed to evade censors and get his story out. There were some especially big surprises on this latter topic. Hersey had gone to Japan knowing that the story he wanted to tell was going to reveal that the US had been covering up its handiwork in the atomic cities, even though it seemed initially that the US government had appeared almost ecstatically forthright about its new weapon. When US President Harry Truman announced that the world's first atomic bomb had just been dropped on Hiroshima, he pledged that if the Japanese did not surrender, they could expect a, quote, rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on this earth. The bomb, a nearly 10,000-pound uranium bomb dubbed Little Boy, had packed an explosive payload equivalent to more than 20,000 tons of TNT, the president revealed, and was by far the largest bomb ever used in the history of warfare. The press coverage in the immediate aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki 3 days later was frenzied. Images of the mushroom clouds and landscape devastation released by the US military ran on front pages around the world. But at this point, no foreign press was yet on the ground in Japan. They were all still largely relying on military-issued information. Despite the crush of early coverage of these bombings, there was little reporting on the human toll beneath those mushroom clouds and the true aftermath of the then experimental weapons, thanks to immediate US government efforts to control information about the aftermath of the bombings in Japan. Some leaders in the United States, which had just won a painfully earned victory over Axis powers, had already been concerned that it might, quote, get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities, end quote, as the country's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, put it after the firebombing of Tokyo earlier that year. Right away, officials in Washington, D.C. and General MacArthur's newly arriving occupation forces in Japan went into overdrive to contain the story of the human cost of their new weapon. Before Allied troops came ashore, the Japanese media had begun reporting widely on the aftermath in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and disturbing reports began to filter over to the United States about a sinister post-bomb affliction that was killing off blast survivors in the most agonizing manner. For the incoming occupation leadership, the timing of these early reports could not have been worse. U.S. forces were converging upon the Japanese islands, preparing to move tens of thousands of occupation troops into the country, including the atomic cities. Then the world's first Hiroshima dispatch in a Western media outlet broke, worrying leadership even more. Former United Press, or UP, journalist Lesley Nakashima had gotten into Hiroshima on August 22nd. 5 days later, UP ran his eyewitness account of what he had seen in the country. The city of 300,000 had vanished, Nakashima reported. Not a single building had been left standing intact in the city. Hiroshima was a horrific landscape of rubble and ash. Nakashima also reported that Little Boy had not finished its handiwork on August 6th. Blast survivors, quote, continue to die daily from burns suffered from the bomb's ultraviolet rays, end quote, he reported, adding that, quote, the majority of the cases at surviving hospitals are held to be hopeless, end quote. As occupation troops arrived at the end of August, they worked quickly to put an end to such reports, but not with total success at first. Australian war reporter Wilfred Burchett, correspondent for London's Daily Express, managed to get away from his occupation minders by faking a case of rampant diarrhea. His PRO officers left him in barracks to recover. This was their mistake. Burchett fled, managed to make his way into Hiroshima, and file a horrifying report, which ran under the all-caps headline, The Atomic Plague. This was his warning to the world, he wrote, confirming Nakashima's earlier report of total devastation, and also that a sinister, quote, disease X was painfully killing. Eventually returned to Tokyo sick and exhausted, he arrived while U.S. officials were in the process of giving a press conference, denying rumors that radiation was killing off blast survivors. These officials had been dispatched to Japan by General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, to quickly study the after effects of the bombings, and had been heavily pressured to sound the all-clear siren about the conditions in those cities. These officials were in the middle of downplaying the aftermath when Burchett dramatically materialized at the conference, unshaven and dirty, and confronted the officials about what he had seen. "You've fallen to Japanese propaganda," he was told. Burchett was subsequently hospitalized, and while he was there, his camera film containing images of Hiroshima mysteriously disappeared. Probably unsurprisingly, he also learned that his press accreditation had been revoked by the PRO. Burchett's report had been quite displeasing to the U.S., but occupation officials were able to intercept what would have been an equally devastating early report out of Nagasaki, which American reporter George Weller of the Chicago Daily News was attempting to file. Weller had zero respect for General MacArthur and his censors. Quote, "I had a right to be in Nagasaki, closed or not," end quote, Weller stated later. "I was not going to be stifled," he added. He composed a 10,000-word report on the equal horrors he had witnessed in post-bomb Nagasaki, but unlike Burchett, he was not able to get his report out. It was successfully intercepted and quote-unquote lost. Occupation officials quickly corralled the remaining press, and by then hundreds of foreign correspondents had come into Japan to cover the September 2nd surrender ceremony. And they were corralled into what Wilford Burchett later called a press ghetto in Yokohama, a port city near Tokyo, and a point of entry for occupying troops. By then, SCAP, which stood for Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, and which meant both General MacArthur himself and his occupation forces, had strict control over which reporters can enter the country and whether they could travel around it. General MacArthur detested some correspondents and hated certain publications. For example, the New York Herald Tribune, the Chicago Sun, and the San Francisco Chronicle embodied, in his opinion, quote, downright quackery and dishonesty. Even correspondents from Time, Inc., owned by the ultra-patriotic Henry Luce, were under close scrutiny. Eventually, reporters were able to come from Yokohama to Tokyo, but their leashes were kept short. General MacArthur was given regular reports on the press, and occupation forces kept close tabs on accredited reporters, their political dispositions, what they were writing, even their health. SCAP largely controlled the transportation and the food in Japan, so if you, as a reporter, had any intention of traveling around the country or even eating, you were under thumb. As one occupation reporter put it, quote, the army kept a tight grip on all living under it. Everyone was told how much to smoke, how much gasoline to use, and how many cigarettes to smoke. End quote. Reporters filed dispatches back to the States from a public relations building, formerly the HQ of Radio Tokyo, monitored by General MacArthur's PR officers. General MacArthur's initial head of PR, General Legrand Diller, known to the correspondents as Killer Diller, at one point ensured that reporters who were trying to cover a meeting between Japanese Emperor Hirohito and General MacArthur were met with bayonets. General Diller's eventual replacement, Brigadier General Frayne Baker, proved only marginally less hostile. At one point, he told the Tokyo-based foreign reporters that they could be court-martialed for publishing classified material under the Articles of War because the United States and Japan were still technically at war. Then he informed them that SCAP's officers could declare any information classified that it liked. As for the Japanese media, SCAP also enacted a strict press code, corralling them, too, even more strictly. They weren't even allowed to mention Hiroshima in poetry, much less a press report, lest they, quote, disturb the public tranquility, end quote, which was one of the provisions of the press code. Meanwhile, the US government had an inside job reporter helping them to downplay the effects of the bombs. The New York Times' William Atomic Bill Lawrence, an old guard science reporter well-versed in atomic matters, had been secretly hired away from the Times by Manhattan Project head General Leslie Groves that previous spring. Atomic Bill was henceforth to function as sort of an in-house official historian of the evolution of the bomb, but he also helped create PR materials, including fake obits of the Manhattan Project principals in case the bomb testing went horribly wrong and wiped them out. General Groves and other US officials began a PR campaign to deny the early reports that Japanese blast survivors were dying of radiation, and Atomic Bill played a role in presenting that narrative to the American public. General Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer carted Atomic Bill and a junket of other reporters to the New Mexico testing site, where the first atomic bomb in history had been detonated on July 16, 1945. The desert sand around the epicenter of that blast had been transformed into green glass, and radioactivity lingered due to the low height of detonation. Yet Atomic Bill duly reported that the area was completely safe and that Japanese reports of radiation-induced deaths in that country were, quote, Tokyo tales. General Groves continued the downplay and deny bomb radioactivity PR campaign throughout the fall, and even when he did concede in front of a congressional committee that some in Japan may have died from radioactivity, he stated that radiation poisoning was, quote, actually a very pleasant way to die, end quote. In August of 1945, back in the States, reporter John Hersey was at something of a crossroads. He was already very accomplished at the tender age of 31, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, a commended war hero, and a veteran war correspondent for Time magazine, having covered several theaters of war since 1939. He had just left Time and was beginning life as a freelancer. Hersey was in New York when the Hiroshima bombing was announced, and he had conflicted feelings about the attack. On one hand, he was in despair over the scale of death and felt fear about the world's future in the new atomic age. On the other hand, he did feel that the bombing would likely hasten the end of the war. Then, when the US bombed Nagasaki 3 days later, Hersey was horrified. It was, in his opinion, quote, a totally criminal action, end quote. He felt that the US had not given Japan sufficient time to respond before killing tens of thousands of people, mostly civilians. He knew right away that he was going to write someday about the bombings. He just didn't know yet in what capacity. Then, in the fall of 1945, Hersey had lunch with the New Yorker's deputy editor, William Shawn. The men discussed Hiroshima, included that something was off about the coverage of the post-bomb city. Given that it had been the site of one of only 2 nuclear attacks in history, it had disappeared from headlines with suspicious rapidity, they felt. Furthermore, they mutually realized what coverage there had been in the early days had focused almost exclusively on landscape and building devastation, not on the human toll and suffering, what the bomb had done to human beings. It's unclear whether Hersey and Shawn knew the extent of the restrictions that had been imposed on Tokyo-based reporters, but they likely had some idea. The American journalism world was then very close-knit, and many of Hersey's wartime friends and colleagues had been posted to Japan to cover the occupation, and he would have had some sense of the restrictions. The 2 men decided that Hersey would try to get into Japan and write about what happened, quote, not to buildings but to human beings, end quote, as Hersey later put it. Now, when I first came to this topic, I thought that Hersey had likely gotten into Japan and then gotten out again, undetected by MacArthur's forces. And only when I started really researching General MacArthur's domination of Japan did I realize how impossible it would have been for any journalists now some 8 months into the occupation, because Hersey didn't get in until May of 1946, to try to access that country solo. Again, SCAP wielded near total control over who could enter Japan. Journalists had to be vetted and cleared for entrance to the country, and then vetted and cleared to travel around the country. And even if you were cleared to travel, you were given a limited time in each destination. So Hersey was not going to be able to sneak in. He would have to apply for clearance. However, he had some advantages that the more combative reporters, like George Weller, did not. And as I say in Fallout, Hersey was the perfect Trojan horse candidate to be admitted to the country. His own wartime record would have made him seem relatively innocuous to SCAP. After all, he wrote for Time and Life. He had played by the rules throughout the war as an accredited war correspondent. He had written glowing wartime profiles of members of the military, including one quite laudatory biography of General MacArthur himself, with the help and the approval of the War Department. Hersey later stated that he wished he could have taken Men on Bataan out of circulation because it had been too complimentary to MacArthur. But, you know, if you're vying to get into occupied Japan, having something like this is going to help immeasurably, and Hersey's chances looked better than average. He began his reporting trip in China and applied from there for clearance to Tokyo. His wartime cooperation must have worked in his favor, for clearance was indeed granted along with military transport into Japan. However, just because he'd been granted entry did not mean that he was going to be given free rein. Not only was SCAP monitoring him, again, as they closely monitored everyone from the Occupation Press Corps, Tokyo-based FBI operatives and the FBI in DC were appraised of his arrival. He was going to have to tread carefully. It may seem miraculous when I tell you that he was given permission to travel briefly to Hiroshima for a limited time as well. Access to the atomic cities was still then restricted all of those months later, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained restricted topics, but a few factors helped Hersey get access. First of all, his timing was good. The US government and occupation forces now felt that they had resolutely contained the aftermath story for so many months that Hiroshima was being seen increasingly as quote unquote yesterday's news. The public had moved on, and just as importantly, the much subdued press corps in Japan had moved on. Even if reporters had chafed about being restricted over Hiroshima and Nagasaki that previous fall, now there were new scoops to vie for, new developments to cover. For example, there were war crimes trials going on in Tokyo, and there was also the story of Japan's transformation from hated wartime enemy to emerging Cold War ally. When Hersey applied to SCAP GHQ for clearance to travel to Hiroshima, there may have been some bemusement at SCAP about why a reporter of Hersey's stature was asking to go to the site of such a quote-unquote old story. especially when his lesser-known colleagues had all but given up on it. And occupation forces had been allowing journalists into Hiroshima in recent months, but mostly to report on how quickly the city was allegedly making a comeback. There were indeed earlier that spring some more nothing to see here stories, including this one in the New York Times, noting how much of the population had returned and how they were planting gardens in the ruins and so on. So it's not entirely surprising that Hersey was allowed a glimpse in. Occupation officials who greenlighted his passage to Hiroshima would soon regret the decision. Despite the generous access, Hersey and the New Yorker's William Shawn decided that it was best that Hersey quietly collect his reporting and hightail it back to the US to write the story, away from General MacArthur's PROs. When Hersey did arrive in Hiroshima, he was appalled and terrified by the devastation there, even so many months later. And let's not forget that Hersey was a seasoned war correspondent. He had seen it all in various theaters throughout the war, from combat to concentration camps. He was stunned that all of this destruction had been wrought by a single primitive bomb. He vowed to work as quickly as he could. He made inroads and found several dozen blast survivors who were willing to speak with him, with the help of a resident German priest who spoke Japanese, and a Japanese pastor who had been educated in the US and spoke English as well. Each of the testimonies he encountered were uniquely horrifying. Hersey had decided that he would tell the story of 6 of them, regular folks whose paths had overlapped on that horrible day. He wanted readers to experience the disaster of August 6, 1945, through the eyes of these 6 individual humans, because for him it was imperative that he bring out the human aspect of the bombing and wrestle the story back from clinical casualty statistics. Americans and the world had still yet to comprehend and face what had happened there and what Hiroshima's bombing portended for the future of warfare and the survival of civilization, Hersey felt. Telling individual stories was his way of driving the reality home. He had not been given much time by SCAP on the ground in Hiroshima, just 14 days, including travel. Hersey quickly found his protagonists: a young widow with 3 young children, a young female clerk, a young Japanese medic, a Japanese doctor with his own small hospital, and the German and Japanese pastor who were helping him translate and make inroads among the other blast survivors. Instead of writing the report in Japan under the gaze of MacArthur's PROs and wiring it back to his editors, Hersey took his notes and reporting back to New York City, using military transport back to the States. His trip in and out of Japan had been a success. The Nippon Times even reported that the famous journalist had been, quote, just passing through Tokyo en route to the States, end quote. Hersey wrote his 31,000-word article, again, eventually titled Hiroshima, in just a few weeks. He then edited it in extreme secrecy with New Yorker editors William Shawn and Harold Ross, the magazine's founder, sequestered in Ross's locked office. Almost no one at the magazine was allowed to know what they were working on. Other employees and contributors were even reportedly kept working on a dummy issue. For Hersey and his editors, the Hiroshima writing was akin to their own Manhattan Project. The pressure on the team was enormous. They knew how huge and contentious the story was. It would confront countless Americans who strongly believed that the US occupied the moral high ground in the atomic bombing. It also would reveal how much the US government had covered up about the bombings and the radioactive after effects of the new bombs. And it might also embarrass SCAP, obviously, which had given Hersey access to Hiroshima in the first place. Even depicting the Japanese victims themselves in human terms was going to be controversial. The article took up the entire contents of the August 31st, 1946 issue of The New Yorker. The international publication was explosive, which is how Hersey put it, not me. I personally tried very hard to avoid using that word throughout my book for obvious reasons, but Hersey was right in this characterization. And I don't want to give away too much about the fallout of his reporting, but Hiroshima basically stopped America in its tracks and caused an international furor. Readers across the country were transfixed and horrified as they were transported into the aftermath of the nuclear attack of August 6, 1945, and the awful days and months that had followed. Even those who still wholly supported the bombings were shaken, not least of all because they knew that the United States would not have the nuclear monopoly forever, and that the country itself would, in the future, be vulnerable to the same sort of nuclear holocaust depicted in Hersey's pages. The government's cover-up was indeed revealed. Editorials and readers across the country demanded to know what other information about the bombs and bombings had been concealed from them. The US government was put very much on the defensive. The record needed to be set straight, said President Truman privately, although he never would comment on Hiroshima in public, beyond stating that he, quote, never read the New Yorker because it only made him mad, end quote. Efforts were made to put the genie back in the bottle via a factually challenged and evasive retort article in Harper's Magazine, ostensibly authored by former Secretary of War Henry Stimson, but in reality co-authored by what one biographer called the Old Boy War Department Club. In this article, Stimson and his co-authors tried to re-seize the narrative, asserting that the bomb had saved lives, both American and Japanese lives, and that it had quickened the war. However, the retort glossed over the unique agonies depicted in Hersey's story. Quote, the face of war is death, shrugged Stimson. The article never once used the word radiation and did not even attempt to address the cover-up, and nor could it erase the now indelible portrait of nuclear war that Hersey had presented to the world. Meanwhile, certain military leaders were finding an unlikely utility for Hersey's report. General Groves, who had played such an outsized role in the initial cover-up of the true after effects of the bomb, now perversely promoted the article within the military as a way for the military to prepare for nuclear attack on the US and also restructure civilian centers to offset damage and loss of life. He also saw the article as a way of drumming up support for an even bigger nuclear arsenal. After all, if the Soviets were going to have nukes soon, the United States, in his opinion, needed to have the, quote, best, the biggest, and the most nuclear weapons. Now that Americans could, thanks to Hersey, imagine nuclear attacks on their own cities and towns, perhaps they could be compelled to maintain the US's nuclear superiority. This, of course, could not have been further from Hersey's intentions in writing the article. On the other side of the Pacific, General MacArthur also found comparable uses for the article. His immediate reaction upon reading Hiroshima is unknown, although it surely was not lost on anyone in Washington, D.C., again, that SCAP had given Hersey access to that country in the first place. Yet General MacArthur publicly evinced no embarrassment or indignation about the story. Then, in due course, the New Yorker was contacted by the military asking if a special edition of the article could be made because, quote, General MacArthur plans to reproduce the piece to be used for instructional purposes within the Army in the Far East Theater, end quote. Even though Hersey's story did give General Groves and General MacArthur some unlikely material for training their forces and trying to rally support for nuclear advantage, the story has stood for more than 7 decades as a pillar of deterrence. We know today what nuclear attack looks like because John Hersey was the first to show us, and his portrayal has made it harder for generations of leaders to wield the weapons, use the weapons, and portray the weapons as conventional mega weapons. Hersey's Hiroshima, again, remains the most influential work of investigative journalism ever written. The account remains widely read around the world today, although still not enough. People seem to be losing today their visceral horror of nuclear war. Today in this country, there is an increased willingness to sanction preemptive nuclear attacks, even if it means that more than 1 million civilians might die in such an attack. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has set its doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight, with midnight being nuclear apocalypse. The clock has never been so close to midnight before, not even in 1953 when the first thermonuclear weapons were detonated. Today, we have more than enough warheads to destroy human civilization many times over. Never has the nuclear landscape been more perilous, and never have we needed Hersey's account more to remind us of the realities of nuclear warfare. Thank goodness, then, that he wrote that flattering biography of General MacArthur. Without it, we might never have gotten his report, which may have saved millions of lives in the decades since it came out in 1946. The end.
Thank you, Lesley. That was pretty interesting.
Thank you. I'm exhausted experiencing that presentation again.
I bet. Well, you've been gracious enough with your time to join us for some questions. So if you're ready, we'll get started now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And I just wish I was doing it in person.
We do too. All right, so if anybody listening in tonight has any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We're a little limited on time tonight, but we'll get to as many questions as we can, and we'll go ahead and start now. What led you to this particular story?
Oh, it's such a specific question, but a big one also. I came at the story not looking to write about nuclear apocalypse, but really to tell. I knew that I wanted my next big nonfiction book to be about journalism and a historical example of an act of journalism or a work of journalism that would really drive home to Americans today how unbelievably important journalism is in our democracy. I mean, our journalists are under unprecedented attack today. And so when I was looking through potential historical narratives, I have an affinity for World War II, and I was mostly looking in the European theater and all of the stories that had been just done to death, whether it was about Murrow or Gellhorn or Hemingway. One night, my husband, who's also a newsman, and I were having dinner, and he said, I wonder how Hiroshima and Nagasaki were covered. And for us as journalists, it was really a logistical question. How in 1945 would you get in on the ground into the site of the only nuclear attacks in history when so little was known about radioactive aftermath and report the story there, especially considering, it's occupied territory. So I began to it was a big moment for me, and I thought, oh my God, that's really interesting. It has to have been written about, and it actually hadn't really been written about. And I dug in and I found Hersey's story, and the story of Hersey and Hiroshima has always been really written from the point of view of how important it had been after the fact, but nobody had told the story of how he had gotten the story that nobody else could, and nobody else had really told the story of how much his article had revealed about how much the U.S. government had withheld from American citizens about the reality of their new bombs. And so in my line of work, when you find a story like that hasn't been told, you vie to be the first to tell it. So that's how I came across to tell it. And I mean, it really couldn't have been a more perfect example of the kind of journalistic story that I was trying to tell, because it really underscores, again, the extreme importance of having a free, independent press that can do investigative journalism unhindered and hold the powerful to account.
We got another question from earlier. This person says, I didn't know about John Hersey until I read about this event. Did the author meet him or work with his family on the book?
Well, sadly, Mr. Hersey passed away in 1993. He died of cancer. And he also was not a prolific interview giver. So when I first came into this topic, I really had my work cut out for me, because he didn't leave a huge paper trail. He only gave a few major interviews throughout his life. And I thought, my last subject was Hemingway, who wrote, 5,000 letters a day. And, there's so much of a track record of Hemingway, so much of a breadcrumb trail that you're drowning in information. Well, it turned out, with Hersey, that there was more of him around than I had previously believed. And I was also given access to interview notes, unpublished interview notes that the first round of interviewers had with him in the 70s and the 80s. I did not meet with Hersey's family. Hersey's family takes the stance that Hersey's work should speak for itself. And I, obviously had to respect that stance. And that's actually a continuation of Hersey's own approach to his work, in terms of being deeply reticent about self-publicizing.
Interesting. Another question, 20,000 Australian troops and their 1,000 dependents were stationed near Hiroshima during the occupation. Many of them suffered ailments linked to their exposure to radiation. Was there a propaganda campaign in place to hide the dangers of the atomic cities from occupation troops? And then there's a follow-up. Did American occupation troops experience issues with radiation?
That's a really big question. So during the first part of the occupation, 27,000 occupation troops were stationed in Nagasaki, and I think 40,000 in Hiroshima, at least in the fall of 1945. And I'm not really sure how, I mean, because my book really concentrates on how the story of the bombs was unrolled to the American public. So I'm not really sure how the issue was presented by the military to incoming troops. It's super interesting. I feel like that would be a subject of a really important narrative standalone study. Now my interest is piqued. I think, when I'm thinking about the journalists who were first coming in, they were approaching, their time in occupation zones with sort of a gallows humor, are we all going to be sterile? But it was definitely a nervous kind of humor. So they knew, the first wave of occupation journalists who were coming in with the first wave of occupation troops, they did have some sense that there was something awry, or, that there was a probable or possible danger there. And as I say in my presentation, part of the reasons why General Groves dispatched a fact-finding mission in Hiroshima in late August and early September of 1945, ahead of the arrival of those occupation troops, was to find out whether it was indeed safe for the troops to go there, because they didn't really know. I mean, these were experimental weapons. They didn't know how much residual radiation there would be. And so this mission was super interesting, and it was actually detailed in a now forgotten Daniel Lang story for the New Yorker, who profiled one of the doctors who had been on that mission. And that doctor described to Lang the extreme pressure that was on the principals of the mission that was coming from Washington and from Groves in particular to declare Hiroshima radiation free. And the mission did declare it to be safe for occupation, mostly because they looked at, the height that the bomb had been detonated, and they concluded that most of the radiation had been absorbed back into the atmosphere. And that was their quick take. And so in come the troops. One journalist who had traveled there, who we also featured in the presentation, Wilford Burchett, begged to differ about this, but he was told by US officials that he had, again, fallen victim to Japanese propaganda. And so by fall of 1945, you have tens of thousands of occupation troops who are, some of them are even being bunkered down by Ground Zero in Nagasaki. I saw anecdotal evidence in my research that Ground Zero had been roped off because of possible radiation concerns, even though the official line was that it was radiation free. But it still also was a selfie destination, Ground Zero in Hiroshima, and a lot of troops would go there and go souvenir hunting in the ruins. So there was a sort of a back and forth relationship with it. By some it was considered to be dangerous, and some considered it to be just okay, or they took their chances. Also, when I was researching this book, I have heard from many veterans, descendants whose grandfathers and grandfathers were stationed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who later died of cancer. There's a huge movement of what are called atomic vets in the States, and I have a definition of them. So the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, they call an atomic veteran somebody who has, as part of his or her military service, participated in above ground nuclear tests from 1945 to 1962, or as part of the U.S. military occupation forces in or around Hiroshima and Nagasaki before 1946. It's unclear to me how much has been conceded in terms of allotment of care for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki vets, in terms of how much radiation existed in 1945 and 1946 in the immediate aftermath, but there has been some concession that they may have been affected.
Mm-hmm. And a bit of a follow-up question from earlier. You had mentioned Hersey's passing. A couple of people want to know if he linked that illness to his radiation exposure from his time in Hiroshima, and if any other journalists suffered from visiting those areas.
To the best of my knowledge, Hersey did not link that. link that back to his brief time in Hiroshima. He was only on the ground in Hiroshima for a couple of weeks, and he would not go back to Hiroshima for another 40 years after that. In terms of other journalists from this period who visited and were sickened, Wilford Burchett, who you guys saw in my presentation, who was the Australian reporter, who was the first occupation reporter. He came out of Hiroshima very sick and had a plummeting white blood cell count. He was hospitalized when he got back to Tokyo. He believed that was due to exposure to residual radiation, although he was never given, how do I put this, conclusive, confirming reports from the medical officials who treated him there.
Okay. All right. Now we have a question from someone who identifies himself as the child of a Korean comfort woman. And the question is, there were more crimes in that war than justice. The war crimes trials were flawed, but could not be overshadowed by information about the bombs. Was there a way to tell the truth about the bombs without lessening Japanese war crimes?
Okay, well, first of all, my sympathy to the questioner's mother, because rape and sexual slavery as weapons of war are horrific and inexcusable, and I'm extremely sorry for her ordeal. It's important for me to say here that Fallout does not downplay Japanese war crimes, and it's also equally important to state that Hersey's work in Hiroshima did not downplay Japanese wartime atrocities either. In some respects, Hersey was an unlikely candidate to have written a work that humanized Japanese bombing victims. Hersey was born in China. He was passionately loved the country of his birth. He reported from China during the war and in the aftermath of the war, and saw what the Japanese had done in that country. He had covered the Japanese battling with the Americans in the Solomon Islands, and he saw firsthand what he described as the tenacity and sometimes cruelty of the Japanese soldier. But he's an extraordinary storyteller also, in the sense that even in the moment when he was covering battle between the Japanese and the Americans in the Solomon Islands, he was differentiating between the idea of the Japanese and the Japanese military and the individual who was shooting at them. And he was able, even in that moment, to humanize that individual. He said later he would wonder, oh, is that person a father? Is he a young boy? What dreams have been robbed from him? How did he get conscripted? So the ability to again humanize in that moment is not something that many people were doing. So Hersey, as a war correspondent, had seen absolutely the worst in humanity during World War II, and for him, Hiroshima, it was not about in any way pushing under the rug what Japan had done in Nanking and Manila throughout the Pacific theater to Pearl Harbor. He was enraged by Pearl Harbor, but his work was at heart about two things. It was one about warning the world about the future of war and human civilization now that we had entered into the atomic age. And namely, he felt that human civilization could not survive another global war in the nuclear era. And then two, that the dehumanization that he had seen across the board during the war had to be reversed and stopped. He had seen evidence of atrocities of the Germans against everybody, the Japanese against the Chinese. And so for him, he felt that dehumanization had enabled atrocities by all races against other races. And so by telling the stories of the bombings in his mind, it didn't downplay the Japanese atrocities. Although, to be fair, not everybody then saw it that way. I mean, some saw his reporting as being sympathetic or excusing, the Japanese. And many people who saw his reporting, continued to believe, as did President Truman, that, this largely civilian Japanese population had simply gotten what it deserved in the bombing. But again, for Hersey, it was always about warning about wartime and dehumanization now that we were in the atomic age, and warning that it was a different ballgame altogether now.
That's probably the one area where he reminds me of General MacArthur just a tiny bit. because MacArthur could identify an enemy and want to completely destroy an enemy, but then he was also very kind of interested in developing kind of a nuanced understanding of a person as an individual. So that's something I thought was really interesting about Hersey. Leads us into some more questions. Someone wants to know about Hersey's glowing profile on MacArthur during the war and how this allowed him entry into Hiroshima after the war to write the story. Can you talk a little bit more about his relationship with General MacArthur?
I don't know that there was much of a direct relationship between Hersey and MacArthur. And so here's the book that he wrote. I happen to have this lovely first edition. There it is, in my baton. And to the best of my knowledge, Hersey did not interview General MacArthur directly for this. He did profile MacArthur and many of the men who were under him and interviewed many of their families. He did work closely with the War Department on this book, so it was definitely a sanctioned and a sanctioned work. They even when they were advertising the book, part of the advertisement was that it had been worked on with the War Department, which was kind of astonishing. Honestly, later on, Hersey said that he wished that he could have taken the book out of print because it was too laudatory. He was embarrassed by it. It was written, in the early part of the war, a flush of patriotism. I've read it several times while I was researching. I didn't find it overly, effusive. But at the end of the day, a lot of the reporters who, MacArthur's PRO or press relations office were dealing with were, more combative, hardcore, war veterans. And, they hadn't written, profiles like this. And they were not, friends to the military. They were not, hadn't written, in conjunction with the War Department biographies. And so Hersey, again, having something like this in hand and having the reputation for being a friendly, a friend to MacArthur, when your application is being evaluated for entrance into MacArthur's kingdom, it's probably going to help significantly, as I said in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was looking in MacArthur's library earlier this week, and he also has a first edition of that book. So we know he probably read it. What's interesting, though, I think too, is that Hersey doesn't appear on kind of the main list of reporters that MacArthur really doesn't like, and I think that's interesting.
Because there would have been no reason, because again, Hersey, this was not the only flattering thing he wrote. Hersey really wrote quite a few flattering military profiles throughout the war, including, by the way, of John F. Kennedy. And a profile that he wrote of John F. Kennedy for the New Yorker has been credited with helping to launch Kennedy's career. And that profile, which really showcased Kennedy's heroics during an incident in the Solomon Islands, was printed out and distributed during his campaigns, his political campaigns. So it was a huge part of the Kennedy legend. So, Hersey would not have been on that short list of hated reporters. He was not a red flagger.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Here's an interesting one. What are the pros and cons of the bomb? I guess the use of the bomb.
Well, I'm not sure if the question is about sort of a macro question about the pros and cons of the existence of the bomb, or about the use of the Hiroshima bomb specifically, but I'll assume the latter. Look, firstly, Hersey's work was never explicitly a referendum on the morality of the decision to drop the bomb. He really went out of his way to make sure that that was not in the text. But of course, after the article came out, that was the crux of the public discussion about it. And, along with, anxiety about the future when when the U.S. would no longer have the nuclear monopoly. So, back then and now, the pros were asserted, the pros of the bomb were asserted as such. So it had, it was said, that it shortened the war and it saved lives on both sides. It had prevented a land invasion, which had been planned for the fall of 1945. So this was the official line. And after Hersey's story came out, the US government worked really hard to shift attention away from the portrayal of nuclear aftermath and the radioactive aftermath of the bomb back to these talking points. The government didn't do much to rebut Hersey's reporting about how the bomb was, a new experimental mega weapon that continued to kill long after detonation. But they were successful in really driving home the idea that this was a lifesaver. They weren't able to portray it as a humane lifesaver anymore, but they still were successful in saying this had saved lives. The cons of the bomb in that moment were that, after Hersey's reporting came out, there was global awareness that nuclear warfare and nuclear weaponry now constituted a threat to the survival of civilization. And there's this anecdote that I cite in Fallout about, Albert Einstein was asked once, what would World War III look like? And he said, I don't know how World War III will be fought, but if nuclear weapons are involved, I can tell you how the fourth World War will be fought, and that is with rocks. So many have argued that over the decades, as the arms race progressed, that nukes have actually prevented war because of mutually assured destruction. So you don't enter into war as easily because if nukes are involved. That's it for both sides. Game over. But many of the experts whom I've consulted for this book and with whom I've done events for this book in the last couple of weeks, they fear that another nuclear confrontation, whether as the result of hostilities or whether as the result of a mistake, a technical mistake or a miscommunication, is not a question of if, but when. So I would call that a con of the bomb.
All right, here's a longer question. This is from somebody who was a POW of the Japanese, civilian POW. My introduction to the horrors of atomic warfare was gained from newsreels before I read John Hersey's book when I was 12 years old in 1947, and I could give little empathy for the plight of the Japanese, having lived in a city in China that the Japanese bombed and occupied in 1937, then spent 3 more years in harsh Japanese internment camp in Manila. The thing that strikes me is that just 2 atrocities by the Japanese, the rape of Nanking and the Manila massacre, killed twice as many people as the A-bombs. And these killings were done on a personal basis with gun, bayonet, sword, fire, and torture. Many modern historians now conclude that America was as bad at committing atrocities as Japan. What do you think about that trend in academia? It's a tough one.
Yeah. Look, the US in real time was very concerned with avoiding a reputation for atrocities, in that moment, whether it was, the use of what was termed Jap barbecues, which was, setting caves to afire with napalm as they were fighting through islands in the Pacific. The US firebombing of Tokyo concerned US leadership. Again, we have the line from Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, saying, we don't want to be known for outdoing Hitler in atrocities in this war. And then, the use of the atomic bomb in a largely civilian population. It's been estimated that around 90% of Hiroshima, even though it did have military value, 90% were civilians, and that it would have been an internationally illegal action today. That was, obviously a morally complicated military action. I will say, Hersey saw war as an equal opportunity degrader of human nature. And there's this great quote from him where he says, that during World War II, I'm butchering this, but he said, what I learned is that war makes no national, racial, or ideological distinctions as it degrades human beings. And he meant that as human beings being degraded by perpetrators of violence and atrocities, but also how it degrades the perpetrators of violence and atrocities themselves. And I will say that, look, for me personally, the most horrific part of my research had not to do with the aftermath of the bomb And, you know, I mean, there's some extremely graphic material that I grappled with. I mean, very gory. But one of the first in Allied reporters who got into Nagasaki afterwards interviewed scores of Allied POWs, and I read through those testimonies, and those were honestly the most traumatic testimonies for me, because the Allied POWs who he interviewed had been detained around the Nagasaki area by Japanese, and hearing their testimonies of the one-on-one atrocities that were committed on those POWs was honestly way more traumatic. And in some respects, the torture inflicted on, you know, some of these men with sharpened pencils was as horrific to me as anything caused by the bomb. And I just think, you know, it's a lot easier to kill from thousands of feet in the air like the US did, because when you never see your victims. I mean, the tail gunner of the Enola Gay actually had to call the New Yorker offices after Hersey's Hiroshima came out to get a copy of the report, because he never had any idea of what had happened to the victims, you know, of Hiroshima, what had happened to the city under the mushroom cloud that they photographed as they flew away. You know, and that Holocaust was created at a remove, whereas so many Japanese mass atrocities were really intimate and terrifying. So I have mixed feelings about this trend in academia.
Okay. Do you have any information on Japanese reactions to Hersey's story? And has the imperial family ever addressed it?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know about the imperial family addressing it or not. The Japanese reaction, Hersey's Hiroshima was not allowed to be released in Japan for several years after it came out. So it came out in August of 1946. Two countries that where it was prohibited from being released were Russia, throughout the Soviet Union for reasons I can go into at another point, and Japan, because under the press code of Japan, nothing could be published there about Hiroshima that would, quote, disturb the public tranquility. Hersey wanted to have the account published right away. By the time he left Japan in June of 1946, he already had an agent lined up, you know, who was ready to find a Japanese publisher and a Japanese translation. And translation was going to be no problem. One of his own protagonists from the book raised his hand to do the translation, but repeatedly, you know, they were denied. Hersey's team was denied in terms of getting it translated into Japanese. And it wasn't until in 1948 when Hersey's, I think it was Writers Guild, complained directly to General MacArthur that, you know, Hersey's book and another book were being censored. And it became kind of a public relations kerfuffle. And, you know, by 1949, General MacArthur had relented, and Hersey's Hiroshima was released in Japanese translation. And it was an instant bestseller. I mean, which is not a foregone conclusion, because look, Japan did not need John Hersey to tell them what had happened in Hiroshima. They knew, they just hadn't been able to tell the world. But you know, his work was you know, widely bought. It was critically well received, and it was actually quite philosophically received when I read some of the reviews of it. And you know, I remember one review in particular just was quite wistful, and it said that it hoped that it would be a force for peace. And it has remained in print in Japan ever since, just as it has remained in print in perpetuity in America.
Have a question about Hersey and how he traveled in Japan, specifically from Tokyo to Hiroshima. What kind of transportation did he use? Mm-hmm. And how free was he in his movements and his meetings with the Japanese people? Did he have SCAP handlers following him everywhere?
Okay, so he was given 14 days of transport time to go from Tokyo to Hiroshima Prefecture. And, you know, even though Hiroshima had been obliterated, the train station was in the outskirts of the town, and, you know, the rail line was intact pretty much, you know, from the very beginning. He traveled down by train, and he stayed with military police U.S. military police on the outskirts of the town. And it doesn't appear that he had a minder. They did have some sense that he was interviewing blast survivors, but it apparently did not make any efforts to stop him. It seems like, other journalists by then had come in and out to do other stories, most of them about, how the city was regenerating at that point. And they spoke with blast survivors too, because many of the people who were back in the city by the time Hersey came had been blast survivors. And so he was given kind of a longer leash than you might think, but I think it's because, he had several predecessor journalists come in and out, speak with blast survivors, not write about it in any capacity, mostly because they were occupation journalists and not coming and going like Hersey. And so Hersey was able to take his notes. With his account of how many people he ultimately interviewed varies, but we know that it was several dozen at least. He was able to take his notes, pick 6 of those testimonies, and take that material back to the States and write there. And then to the logistical question, he took the train out of Hiroshima back to Tokyo as well.
Mm-hmm. Did he take any photographs during his time in Hiroshima?
Yes, he took photographs of the 6 protagonists who appear in his book. And actually, I'm just going to grab the first edition because you can see them. Hold up. Sorry, I should have had this right on my desk for you guys, but these are 6 photographs that he took. Now, interestingly, these photographs did not appear in the original article in the New Yorker. There were no visual adornments or illustrations other than a hand-drawn map of Hiroshima to show the aerial view of it. However, these photographs were made available to other journalists who were going to cover the release of Hiroshima through a photo agency called Acme, and many of them did use those photographs, just not the New Yorker itself.
Now, the U.S. War Department sent teams in to document the damage at both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Were those photographs kind of suppressed or controlled in the early years?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, some were released right away, because we saw pictures of the mushroom clouds and landscape devastation right away. Mm-hmm. The War Department and the U.S. government, they had kind of it was a difficult line to walk, because on one hand, they really did want to advertise the might of the bomb. And again, they had the nuclear monopoly at that point. But then, on the other hand, there was, the impulse to downplay the radioactive toll on the blast victims. So they did go in. I mean, for instance, there's a scholar called Greg Mitchell who has documented at enormous length filmmakers, War Department and Army filmmakers who had gone in as part of the strategic bombing survey to take footage of both of the atomic cities. Some of it was color footage, which was amazing. There was one filmmaker with whom Hersey met in Tokyo who had been in Hiroshima before Hersey arrived, they were again there to take footage for the US government's records. And he had kind of sneaked in footage of blast survivors also, because he had said later that he really wanted some record of, again, what the bombs did to humans, and he wanted to document the radioactive toll on the human body. He said later that that footage was taken from him and his team, and it was classified for decades. And it's now no longer classified. I think you can even find some of it on YouTube. But for a long time, it was considered top secret.
Okay. All right, we have time for several more questions. Could there have been a legitimate reason for the cover-up? Not indefinitely, but for a few years at least, to ensure the stability of the occupation. We look at the occupation today as a success, maybe one of the few in history, but that is with hindsight. And this question is from a former Foreign Service officer who's interested in the discussions behind the cover-up policy.
I'm thinking of the initial reasons that were given for like the very, very first days for restricting journalists. And in the very beginning, there's a legitimate reason to keep journalists with troops when they're entering into Japan. And neither MacArthur's forces or the reporters who were traveling with them knew what to expect when they came into occupied Japan. Were they going to be they didn't know what the attitude of the defeated were going to be. I mean, because the Japanese were supposed to be poised to fight to the very last man, right? And a few of the journalists who came in, they were armed, which is, as we know, a violation of the Geneva Conventions, but they felt that they might need to protect themselves. And so the first ones, again, who I profiled in the presentation, the first ones who broke away from their PROs to get to Hiroshima and Nagasaki had guns. I mean, they really did fear for their lives. I mean, one of them on the train to Hiroshima, he didn't sleep for 24 hours because he was afraid he might be beheaded by Japanese nationals. Another one impersonated a colonel, a US colonel, to raise the stakes for any Japanese national who might consider attacking him. But once it was clear that there was going to be cooperation among, the Japanese nationals and their occupiers, and there were no attacks, some of the Allied journalists knew that there were other reasons why they were being restricted from the atomic cities. It wasn't just for their own protection or for the protection of the settling in of the occupation. And so George Weller, who we saw in my presentation, the first one into Nagasaki, had this great quote where he says, I had a right to be in Nagasaki, whether it was closed or not. And, after it was evidence that there were no riots and there were no resistance, I had an obligation and a right to be there to report, and I was not going to be stifled. I mean, he was, so that was his line. And also, another legitimate reason or understandable reason why the US government might not have wanted reporting on from Hiroshima or Nagasaki is, if reporters put out details of the bombing, so for instance, technical details of the bombing as, given by, for instance, by like Japanese physicists or doctors. So, like the height of detonation or reports on the size of the fireball, these were details, scientific details where, it was feared that if they were revealed in a public way, that they might have aided other governments in their efforts to create nuclear bombs of their own. And, to that point, the US government and the War Department, even after official wartime censorship ended, they still, informed editors across the country that anything that was written about nuclear topics or nuclear weapons needed to be vetted to control this information because it was, pertinent to national security. But, for the most part, the restriction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the human toll, it really was, these were experimental megaweapons. And the US itself, Leslie Groves, the Manhattan Project principals themselves, they did not know what the immediate and the long-term effects of these bombs were going to be on humans. And frankly, at the beginning it was, and since they knew it was going to be a bad look for the US in terms of, qualifying its unqualified moral and military victory. And soon, quietly as part of the occupation, they were the US government was sending in medical forces to study Japanese blast survivors in the years to follow to see how the bomb indeed affected, the bodies of men, women, and children, blast survivors. One of Hersey's own protagonists was for years studied by the Atomic Bombing Survey. And recounted, having to stand naked in front of a room of doctors. And, it really scarred her quite considerably. So the fact is that, the true human toll was unknown, but they did know that it was, again, it was squeamish stuff at the very least. And so there were a lot of the motivation behind downplaying or covering up the true human aftermath had to do with reputational protection.
Okay. Here's another question. After the Great War, the League of Nations was set up and then failed. Do you think the existence of the atomic bomb and Hersey's reporting helped the United Nations avoid this fate?
Well, I mean, the bomb is a deterrent for sure. I mean, the fact of nuclear warfare definitely raised the stakes in terms of, you know, incentivizing the UN to be a success. That's a bad way of putting it, but let's put it this way: if war were to break out again in the atomic age, especially in the early days of the UN, I mean, members of the UN now had more of an incentive to make it work and to have international cooperation now that the consequences were so much higher. And again, people, especially in the early days of the UN, they again knew what nuclear warfare looked like because John Hersey had just shown the world. And you know, the fact was now that the world had a way to eviscerate human civilization if a third global war broke out. And so having an international body like the UN as a stopgap to that happening, the stakes were considerably higher, I would argue, than during the League of Nations era.
Hmm. Another question, you spent a whole chapter talking about Hersey's different drafts and edits with the New Yorker staff. As a journalist, what stood out to you the most about the meticulous process?
Well, I mean, the New Yorker is, then and now is famous for its fact checking. And I would say that, you know, during the fact checking of this article, Hersey and his editors went over it in excruciating detail because they knew that it was going to be profoundly controversial when it came out. And if there were any mistakes in it, people were going to be looking to discredit it, and anything, even if it was a tiny mistake, could, you know, cast doubt upon the larger reporting. And so watching those journalists go through together and knowing, you know, the anguish of fact checking and, you know, what we call in this business the terror of error, and anticipate, you know, and living in their mindset, it was quite extraordinary. You know, I don't want to ruin this part for, you know, for would-be readers of the book, but there also was a moment during the editing process in which all of Hersey's work became extremely endangered because there was a new law that was passed by Truman regarding the requirement for anything pertaining to nuclear weaponry, nuclear matters, atomic matters, to be vetted by the War Department. And I won't tell you what happened, but it did pertain to the manuscript that they were working on in that moment. And Hersey's Hiroshima almost didn't happen.
All right. What role did journalists and non-academics play in the writing of history? Why aren't more PhDs tackling these topics?
Well, you know, they always say that journalism is the first draft of history. And, you know, so, you know, for me, when I was documenting this period of time, I mean, journalistic reports, you know, they're not always accurate in the moment, but they do, you know, portray context. They do portray a moment in time. You know, they're unbelievably important. I think that, you know, we're seeing that, you know, the journalistic reports, you know, pertaining to the major issues of our day, for instance, with COVID, you know, these are going to be, you know, historical documents. Why aren't more PhDs devoted to this? I don't know, but they should be. And I mean, I strongly believe that with my research on this, that my own research team and I, we only got to the tip of the iceberg with this. And I'm sure that there is additional material on this topic that will come out. I will say one frustrating element about this topic is that it was estimated by NARA to my research team and me that only 1% to 3% of SCAP's records survive. And we were able to paint a pretty full picture of occupation life and the relationship between PROs and the journalists that they were monitoring. But I can only imagine how much of that, how much more material there was at some point. And not having access to that material was very frustrating. I will also say that there's a big hole in the New Yorker's records, because there was some of their records went missing in a move between Condé Nast and the New York Public Library, when the materials were bequeathed from Condé to the NYPL. And of course, those materials pertained to the period that I was looking at. But again, with what was available to me and to my research team, we were still able to construct a portrait. But I'm deeply eager to see subsequent reports, whether they're academic or journalistic.
Mm-hmm. So what's your next project?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know. I'm still very much, in the moment of bringing this project out to the world. And it took me a while after I finished my last book, which was about Hemingway, to come up with this project. I will say that this particular project has been the most meaningful of my professional life, and I live in fear that I'll never get to work on something that was this enthralling or personally meaningful, or in which the research was more exciting and bountiful. I mean, when you're working on a Hemingway topic, getting anything new is like scratching water out of rocks. But with working on this topic, I mean, there was just such a bounty of information that we uncovered. It was, for a nerd like me, it was heaven.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. We're pretty much out of time at this point. I see a number of you have sent comments to Lesley. We'll make sure that she gets those. We just don't have time to kind of go through them all right now. But Lesley, thank you again for joining us. We know you have a very busy schedule, but it was a pleasure to host you, and I hope at some point you'll be able to come back.
I would love that so much. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you for the help that you lent to me during this project. And thank you so much for everybody who joined us, to everybody who joined us tonight.
All right, thank you. Well, that concludes our program. We will be back next month with a few more programs, so stay tuned and check out our website for details on those upcoming programs. Thank you.